about the trillions of dollars that flooded in taxpayer money that flooded into states during the pandemic to help with the variety of issues that states were facing due to the pandemic. Well, that money needs to be tracked, and there are strings attached for states who receive that kind of federal help. No different in Washington state, where the state recently did an audit to determine how the billions in federal dollars that came into the state were used and whether they were used properly. Well, it turns out that the folks who did that audit had a really hard time finding an answer to that. To explain the situation more thoroughly, I wanted to bring in a friend of mine who knows all about this stuff. Jason, thanks for joining us for Fridays with Friends. Introduce yourself for folks who aren't familiar with you.
Great. Thanks, Brandi. I'm Jason Mercier, the Government Reform Director for the Washington Policy Center, and I've had, the pleasure of studying Washington budget and taxes for about 20 years.
You're like a budget nerd. Is that fair?
Well, I'm using an old state budget to prop up my computer, so I guess that qualifies.
Yes, I love it though. You're always sliding into my DMs, but not with anything inappropriate, with juicy stories and details on taxes and the budget. So I always appreciate you giving me the scoop.
Well, I figure if I'm going to find the information, I should share the joy.
I love it. So there's a couple stories I wanted to have you on to talk about today that you slid into my DMs about. One of them is we know that we got a record amount in many states of federal dollars during COVID. And there has been an audit of a Washington state audit of how this money was used, $37 billion. The audit didn't go very well. Is that a good characterization?
Yeah, when an audit totals over almost 1,100 pages, you know there's going to be some interesting things in it. And this is a federal financial audit that actually happens every single year. The state auditor looks at compliance of state agencies with federal reporting requirements, because we know there's no such thing as free federal funds, and they come with a lot of strings and really stringent reporting requirements to make sure that the money is spent appropriately. But with this particular audit, this was the first one that they've got to dive in those billions, as you mentioned, of the federal COVID relief funds. And the state of Washington did not do a great job, according to the state auditor, of complying with that. In fact, they issued what they call an adverse opinion, which basically means they don't believe they have the data and the information from the state to actually verify that it was used appropriately because of lack of documentation.
So we get all these billions from the federal government, as other states did, to help with COVID relief and everything that entailed. And we didn't track the spending of that well enough for them to even perform a real thorough audit.
Yeah, they basically, on almost all of the COVID funds, they said they had an adverse opinion. But there were findings beyond it. There were over 60 findings for not complying with federal reporting. And I guess the most problematic about that are a couple of things. One, the state auditor basically said for the first time since 2003, they couldn't audit an entire program. The Department of Family Services, on the child care payments they were getting from the federal government, the auditor basically said we just couldn't audit that $273 million because of lack of documentation. And the state auditor said, this is a big deal. There is a possibility the state may have to repay that $250 million back to the federal government. Along with that, 31 of those over 60 findings were repeat findings where the state had not corrected prior problems, some going back decades. So there seems to be a problem of taking these findings by our independently elected state auditor seriously, and it's taxpayer money and it's compliance with federal law.
So just, I don't know if we want to do hypotheticals, but with the $271 million that went to the families department with the state, and is it fair to say it's kind of untraceable at this point? I mean, what if there was fraud? Would there be any way to find out?
Well, this is where now there's some disagreement between the auditor and the agency. The agency says we complied with the federal requirements. We just didn't comply with the extra security the state auditor thinks is appropriate. And in fact, they say that they'd like to do that, but it's going to require more taxpayer money from Washingtonians so that they can meet that reporting requirement. So their response to the audit is we're going to go to the legislature and ask for more money so we can actually meet these requirements recommended by the state auditor.
So they failed an audit. And they say in order to not fail future audits, they need more money?
If you want us to be able to spend the money you're sending us right now appropriately, you got to send us more, was basically the response.
It's like only a government agency could function that way.
Well, and this is why I think you saw that the state auditor actually make the statement that this is a problem. This is a big deal. And Whether or not Congress or the federal budget office is going to require repayment of those funds, probably not, but that's legally a possibility if they say, you know what, you are just doing such a poor job, so bad that your auditor said she couldn't document these funds that we think you owe it back to us.
Just playing devil's advocate, the pandemic at the beginning was a cluster F. I mean, it really was. And so could this just be the fact that they were dealing with an unprecedented amount of money that had to go to an unprecedented number of places, and they just fell short because of that?
Well, that's basically the response from the Employment Security Department, because you may recall they had a little issue with over $600 million of fraud. And their response to the auditor was, well, we disagree with your findings. We think our procedures and our protections are fine, but we had to get this money out fast, and improper payments are just going to be part of that, living with that consequence of having to get the money out fast. I mean, there's a lot of excuses, there's a lot of reasons, but you have an incumbent responsibility of a duty as government officials that when you take these taxpayer resources, you're going to be responsible for them, you're going to account for them, and you're going to comply with the federal requirements. And that's where this 1,100-page audit with over 60 findings said Washington failed spectacularly.
Do you know, I'm assuming other states have to audit their federal spending, or is this like a uniquely Washington thing?
No, I mean, this will come across the board. And, I guess the flip side of this is there was a story out of Idaho yesterday that, along with the state, local governments were eligible for these funds as well. And the story out of Idaho was that several local governments refused to take the funds because they didn't want to be under those restrictions and those burdens of having to track it, or they didn't think they were going to be able to comply with the reporting requirements. So, I mean, they took the proactive step of saying, we know there's a lot of strings, we know there's a lot of reporting requirements, and this just doesn't pencil out for us, so we're not going to take the funds.
Well, that seems very responsible. Not so much in Washington state. They're like, just give us the money, no big deal. I love that. I want to move on to a court case that happened. Governor Jay Inslee, of course, we're still in a state of emergency around COVID. Maybe we can discuss that more in a moment. But there was a court case having to do with his authority to issue a mask mandate. Can you tell me basically the basis for the case and how it turned out?
Yeah, so this was a court of appeals ruling. It had prior been ruled by the Superior Court and upheld the mandate, saying that the governor can do what he did. And this Court of Appeals ruling that came out this week, it was 2-1, and it wasn't a surprise. And the governor will be very boastful about the fact he's won all of these lawsuits, and there's a reason for that. The state of Washington's emergency powers are a total blank check. Basically, the governor can do whatever they want, and that's why all of these lawsuits have failed. But what was noteworthy about this is the dissent was kind of a call to the legislature saying, yes, you've given the governor this blank check, but should there be some type of sideboards? Should an emergency be indefinite with no end period? Should there be at some point an opportunity for legislative oversight? And this dissenting judge, who actually was appointed by Governor Inslee last year, pointed out that there's a lot of responsibility with this, and there's the potential for abuse. Not that the current governor will, but who's to say that the next governor is not going to declare some other emergency and abuse that power? And that's why I think the frustration with the fact now we're over almost 900 days with this. It's not about Governor Inslee. It's not about the policies that he has imposed. It's about our form of governance and who sets policy. That's supposed to be the legislative branch, the public process, not one person behind closed doors indefinitely. And that's where we are kind of unique in Washington with a structural imbalance.
And it's been a frustration of folks like us for a long time. It's like, I think why you don't see Democrats in Olympia, and you can feel free to disagree, but why you don't see them so eager to rein in the governor's emergency powers is because they believe, and perhaps rightfully so, that they'll always have the governor's office. And so why would we try to rein in the power of someone who is of our political party? I mean, is there any other reason you can think of that the legislature wouldn't try to take some of its authority back?
This has really just been puzzling me for the last few years, because when you go beyond the borders of Washington, you go to Hawaii, you go to New Mexico, you go to New York. What are those states? Those are states with Democratic trifectas, governor and legislature. Those legislatures fought back against their governor's emergency powers, not because they disagreed with the policies, but because they were selfish and guarded of their branch, of their role in our republic. And they're like, we're probably going to adopt this policy if you send it to us, but we're the legislature. We make these decisions, not the executive. The executive is supposed to implement policy. So this hasn't been a partisan fight across the country. I don't know why in Washington our legislators feel like they shouldn't have a role in this conversation.
Yeah, it's like they want to be hands off, which is odd to me. It's like you wanted the job, you wanted to get elected to serve your constituents, and you get there and you're like, nah, I don't want any say in that.
And I think that the thing that most people may not realize about Washington's emergency statutes is when the governor issues an emergency order, if he waives a law, that expires after 30 days. That goes back to the legislature for approval, which is why the governor said, well, the legislature has signed off on many of my orders. Well, that's true. However, if the governor issues what's called a restrictive declaration, right? The mask mandate, closing businesses, closing schools, telling you how many people you can have at your house. Those are indefinite. Those never expire. Those aren't subject to legislative oversight. From a governance standpoint, why? What's the rational reason for treating waiving of law and putting restrictions on citizens differently? They both should have the same legislative oversight.
Yeah, and there was confusion about that at the beginning. It was really the most controversial aspects of what the governor was doing that he didn't have any oversight over, and continues not to. If you were a betting man, Jason, you said, we're closing in on 900 days under a state of emergency around COVID. When do you think the governor might decide that it's time to give that up?
And you're currently one of only 13 states that have an active COVID emergency. And we're one of just, I think, 3 that have no end date. All the other ones, because of their emergency powers law, expire unless reapproved. The governor has given us no metrics, no benchmarks for when this order will expire. One possible silver lining, the CDC yesterday came out with new guidance that basically said that going forward, treating vaccinated versus unvaccinated differently in their recommendations, because I think they've estimated between being vaxxed and having prior COVID exposure, 95% of Americans have some level of immunity. So if the CDC is saying, we're not going to make that distinction anymore, maybe the governor will finally come to that conclusion.
And we talked about the CDC's changes in guidance a little earlier on in the podcast. And I mean, the governor came back and beginning of July, said that he was going to mandate COVID boosters. And then he came back earlier this month and said, never mind, we're just going to make it optional and provide some incentives. Given the CDC's new guidance, do you believe that that could impact the governor's current, because he left the original vaccine mandate in place. Do you think that that is something that could go away?
It's the interesting thing about his mandates for the state employees. And initially that new booster one that now he has rescinded because he's in contract negotiations with state employees and realized, maybe we should incentivize that, which I'm not sure if that was science-based or political based. You can answer that question. But those orders are being done separate from the emergency powers orders. He's doing that as the employer. As the employer, they can set the work conditions. But I guess from a standpoint of public health and from science, even if you're the employer and you have the right to do this, if all the guidance is changing nationally, what's your rationale? And, I was thinking to myself also, I don't know if the Attorney General's office is still doing this, but the Attorney General would put restrictions on those attending press conferences saying you have to show proof of vaccination. Does that continue now with this new CDC guidance?
Yeah, and I was actually going to, because you were the one who sent me that, you sent me a press release because I railed on that on the podcast about the fact that makes absolutely no sense to prioritize a booster over access of the press to a government official. And so I had planned today, it was on my list of to-dos to check in with the AG's office and see if they're going to lift that guidance. So I guess we'll find out.
Yeah, and this will kind of tie back to our original conversation on the budget and transparency on those audits. Again, the reason why the governor was changing a mandatory booster requirement to an incentive is because he is in these contract negotiations with state employees. So a little bit of a topic change for you. Those are happening right now, and they're happening behind closed doors with no details released to the public or even to union members, right? It's just the union leadership. But there's something else that is happening in those talks, and that is discussion about pay raises for the next state budget. And we have no details about that. I do know the state employees have been saying, hey, we're getting hammered with inflation and we're having to work a lot of overtime because of inadequate staffing. And you can ask yourself why there's inadequate staffing right now in state agencies. But they're making the case about why they should have a pay raise. Probably a good case, but I think the same argument could be made for the rest of Washingtonians who haven't had any type of tax relief provided for the past couple of years. Yeah, we've got this process right now, just like with the emergency powers, we're behind closed doors. The governor's office is negotiating and will be making these decisions. And the legislature can't change what he agrees to. It's just an up or down vote.
Yeah, I mean, accountability, transparency is something that should be non-controversial, and there's a lot of aspects in our state, at least, where we just don't see it, and this is one of them. Well, Jason, I appreciate your time and your expertise. Like I said, just a budget nerd, and I love it.
Well, I've got to share the budget joy, so I appreciate being on with you today. Thank you.